Hi, everybody, and welcome to Why Postliberalism Failed. This is episode 6. Today is August 2nd, 2024. It is hot as Hades here in Naples, or Ave Maria. But we're in the process of ending uh, Hades because we're building an enormous rosary walk and adoration chapel in the most Catholic city on earth, except for the Vatican. It's just, today we're going to actually talk more to Thomas Howe, since we're going to be looking at his chapters on post-liberal political economy. And as you can see, we actually do have a fairly wide-ranging series of subjects, right? We've done, Salazar, who,
Mhm.
was a corporatist, but, you'll talk about that maybe. But we also talked about analytical philosophy with Valier, and so we're really covering the gambit in no particular order. So we hope to keep you guys guessing like this. If all goes well, next week we'll actually take a little detour from our book to a book by a friend of both of ours. I've actually, at one point in my life, received scotch from this wonderful woman and her husband, and that's Catherine Pikulik, who is a professor of economics at Catholic University of America, and has written a wonderful book called Hannah's Children. And we'll be spending time talking to her about family policy, because this is a source of tremendous interest among Catholic post-liberals, believing, as they do, that the state has a role to play in encouraging marriage and fertility, and having attempted to establish those policies in Hungary, have produced absolutely no success. So we'll talk about what might be the path to success, if it's not literally bribing your people to stay and have babies. There might be better ways of doing that, but that'll have to wait until next week. Um, and so I look forward to doing that. But today we're going to talk to Thomas about post-liberal political economy. And what's unusual about post-liberal political economy is that normally we have a good sense of what that political economy is, but with post-liberalism it's a little different. So maybe Thomas, tell us what, in a short version of what standard political economy is, and maybe how post-liberals vary from it.
Yeah, there are some when it comes to matters of like economics, for instance, just what we just talked about, political economy in terms of like normal everyday economics. There are some things that post-liberals favor that are at least within mainstream debates. They tend to err on the left side of the spectrum for that. They tend to favor more progressive policies on economics, like antitrust legislation, or at least a very expansive view of antitrust legislation, and also um, they tend to be very heavily favor regulations as far as like heavy regulatory scheme when it comes to economics because they don't trust corporations. And that's all within like mainstream debates, and there's a lot of room for debate about how with them on that. Um, on this chapter that I'm writing right now, and I'm about halfway through my research, I'm looking more for the radical aspects of their political economy, things that are sort of outside the mainstream. Because I figured the mainstream debates, there's a million books elsewhere that people can read about it. Um, I'm looking more for what's the ways that they're radical. Um, the two main aspects of this, though, I've narrowed down to their view of constitutional political economy, dealing with constitutional design, and their vehement opposition to capitalism in a competitive marketplace, right? Their promotion of ideas like distributism or corporatism, right? So let's start with the first one, constitutional design, right? Um, if you look in, what's this one? Why liberalism failed? It's probably blurring it out, right? Why liberalism failed by Patrick Deneen. There's at one point he says he's not really focused on like the institutional frameworks. He's more concerned with the ideology that informs them. He says you could probably have these institutional frameworks without the liberal ideology, right? But when you go to his later book, Regime Change, he seems more opposed to the institutional framework itself, right? He has this chapter, the last two chapters, where he outlines his Aristopopulism. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, I think that's how you say it.
He sees liberalism as having created these institutional frameworks that are based around separations. And he wants to oppose those separations with something that's more integrative, right? So the reversal of. So one of the things he criticizes in these chapters is the separation of powers in the U.S. institutional framework, separation of powers and checks and balances. This is last chapter, Toward Integration, Regime Change. Probably blurring out again, right?
Yeah, it's blurring out a little bit, and I'm not sure where my copy went. I think it might be at my house. I may have lent it to someone and forgot, but
Yeah.
I do want to mention that unfortunately Thomas does not have as valuable a copy of Why Liberalism Failed, because not only is mine a hardback, it's signed.
Oh yeah, signed by the author.
And the before times.
When you were chums.
I would say we were friendly acquaintances once.
Yeah.
We had there was a charming evening we had with him and Chad and a fourth person I don't want to bring into the issue, but she's wonderful too. And we were all at the Naples, this very expensive Naples hotel for the values in capitalism thing they did at AEI for a while. And we joked about the champagne vending machine that they had, and I smoked a lovely cigar and had a wonderful conversation. I miss those days, and so now, but I get to have one with you now, Thomas. This is so. What is it about regime change, and why liberalism failed? Why is it that he takes such a hard line against the United States Constitution?
Well, he has his whole argument to this whole.
I should point out that in Conserving America, which is a compilation of his essays in 2016, the introduction has more or less the same argument. That the United States needs to be refound.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Although he tries to like distance himself from making any claims about a constitutional arrangement and why liberalism failed, he clearly was opposed to some of these things. So that's Deneen, right? Deneen doesn't really, problem with Deneen when it comes to constitutional framework design, he just doesn't think very much in terms of institutions. So he states it, he says he doesn't like it. I don't know if he doesn't have the most sophisticated arguments against it outside of his arguments for liberalism, whatever our thoughts on those are. But he spends more time talking about liberalism.
He's got one drum and he bangs it really hard.
One drum and he bangs it really hard. You also find this criticism of checks and balances, separations of state or separation of powers in Saravamari, in Tyranny Inc. It's kind of in the background. He'll say it. He's like, oh, we tend to think our Western governments with separation of powers, checks and balances are so good, and the Eastern ones, like in China, are so bad. But look at all the ways that corporations tyrannize people. Like that's the way he frames it. So he clearly is also opposed to this modern constitutionalism. He's opposed to like the sort of way the constitutional frameworks of Western constitutional democracies is, and with its emphasis on checks and balances.
This is very this is consistent with post liberals of the past. I've been writing or I've nearly finished the section of my chapter on Brazil. And Brazilian integralist action was started by a guy named Plinio Salgado, and he got his start in right-wing, sort of far right-wing politics, opposing constitutionalism. He wanted Getulio Vargas, who was the dictator, more or less, in Brazil at the time, not to be constrained by constitutional order at all. And so there was something called the Constitutionalist Revolution, and he was writing vehemently opposed to it. And you see this as well in other parts of post-liberal integralist and other regimes that are similar to them. in other parts of the 1930s that are decidedly opposed to the idea of ordering a regime in a way that creates space for liberty. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that these countries were quite bad at parliamentary democracies. They didn't have like a history for it. And they were so accustomed to monarchy that they were looking at their own institutions like parliaments as though they were monarchs. And there's no excuse in this case, right? These countries were new to the experience, and so they went astray. But what on earth is going on with Americans who should know better because we've had these for like 2 centuries, more than 2 centuries.
Yeah, I mean, luckily they don't have as big a following as these previous movements did, so that's a good thing, right? Unfortunately, they're highly concentrated in Catholic intellectual sphere where we're part of and we're kind of marginalized from. I mean, would you
That's
say
true.
that's accurate? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I was not invited to restore a nation. Were you, Thomas?
No, I know they stopped inviting me to all their things. So
yeah, when I thought, I'll go to Steubenville and restore a nation, two things went through my head. That the image they used was of Benjamin Franklin, no, known Freemason. I was like, is this an ironic take, or do the people organizing this not know? And the other was that Deneen sort of it was supposed to be sort of a sympathetic account of the city of Steubenville, or the town of Steubenville. It's not that large enough to be really a city, I guess, because he sort of insults the people for having kind of a busted city. He's trying to say like this is what liberalism does to the heartland, but it kind of comes off as in like, this isn't Budapest. I was just there. Anyway, I like to talk trash, and I'm thoroughly caffeinated and incredibly tired from writing last night. So get us back on track. I don't even remember what we were saying. Oh, I think we were segueing from Amari to maybe Adrian.
Yeah, so Adrian is really the theorist here. I mean, he actually at least engages in considerations of constitutional design and he has been for some time. So his most recent popular book here, Common Good Constitutionalism.
Yeah.
He spends a little bit of time on the constitutional design. A lot of it, though, just references back to old writings that he has. In one of those old writings is this one that he had from, let's see, what is it, 2000 and in his pre-Catholic days. Do you remember when Adrian converted?
No, he actually has an account of his conversion in a book that I've always wanted to read.
It might not have actually been his pre-conversion days because this looks like it was published in 2014. It's called The Constitution of Risk.
Apparently, it was 2016, maybe 2015.
Okay. So he's like right on the threshold there. Adrian used to be a big defender of sort of the war on terror and giving a lot of discretion to the CIA and stuff. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, is this correct? This was always the reputation I had of him, was that he was the guy that defended torture.
Yeah.
But I mean, I never read the thing that he wrote or the statements that he may have made to that effect. But it was sort of like, you don't like what John Yoo has to say. Wait until you meet Adrian, right? Was sort of how I was introduced to this. And like you were saying, this is back in his neoconservative days.
Yeah.
And this was the kind of stuff that was, because I was educated in kind of a neocon world. I'm not sure how much I would really map onto that anymore. It's kind of hard to say because neoconservative is kind of falling apart. But yeah, that was definitely his beat. He's always been an adamant defender of executive discretion at the expense of sort of public accountability and representative government. But you are now more of an expert on his work than I am, having combed through this material.
Well, no, it's helpful. I'm halfway through here, so I'm still trying to sort it out, and it's complicated, and it's the challenge for me when I'm writing this chapter is trying to identify the key themes and the key arguments that he has. Now, he frames the Constitution of risk in terms of like risk management. He frames it in terms of people like James Madison are on the side of this sort of precautionary standpoint where they're trying to prevent the worst things from happening, whereas he's trying to promote a more optimizing view of constitutional arrangement so that we can optimize the goods. Now, I'm really skeptical of the framing of that, but even by the end, he admits you can adopt his optimizing framework and then just agree with the framework that Madison set up. Like you can agree with the founders with his perspective of optimizing. He doesn't think he should. He thinks he should adopt more of his viewpoint of rule by the administrative state and his discretion. He takes, although he does say some things in favor of parliamentary government as opposed to the U.S. system in here as well. So it's not just administrative state. Later, he writes an article for the Washington Post where he says, "Imagine there were no Congress." He basically thinks you could get rid of our Congress and just have the administrative state run everything, and then we'd have a better government, right?
And this is the kind of stuff that earns him this introductory sort of statement, right? Like you often hear people when they're about to say something very critical of Adrian's integralism or his constitutional interpretation that's in common good constitutionalism, is they'll say, well, he is an expert in administrative law. And apparently that expertise in administrative law is the desire to suspend Congress. Is that what makes him an expert? I honestly don't know, but I've never had, everyone just sort of says it. And I've never really known what it is that he has accomplished. So do you know?
I'm still reading. I'm reading through his Law and Leviathan, Redeeming the Administrative State.
So maybe it's to be decided in our case. Maybe we're just ignorant. So maybe it's just to be decided and we're just ignorant.
I mean, I just, the thing is my research isn't really going to go into his expertise in administrative law. It's more
very good. Yeah.
Delve into like constitutional frameworks. But I mean, I'll just take the general consensus for granted that is very good at administrative law. I mean, Elena Kagan frequently cites him every time there's some sort of case about administrative law. Elena Kagan's citing Adrian Vermeule. I don't know.
She's a very serious woman too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and Cass Sunstein is also well regarded in that respect. Although Cass Sunstein, it's funny, somebody described them as sort of a horseshoe pair.
Yeah,
because he's more on the left, right? I mean, they sometimes call him conservative, but he's not a illiberal. He's not
right. I think he's the most cited law professor, isn't he? At this point, Cass Sunstein.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so
you can tell we don't really travel in legal scholarship all that often. If I'm sitting here saying this about Adrian and everyone's like, "Oh, of course he is. What's wrong with you?" It's like, hey man, I'm asking. All right, like.
Yeah, no. I mean, I know a lot more with the people who do deal with constitutional law, and I guess that's where Adrian has
moved to. Yeah.
Yeah, he's moved to. Well, anyway, so it's very like to situate this within the standpoint of the tradition of anti-liberalism, as you were saying. It's no coincidence that Vermeule is a big fan of Carl Schmitt, right? Carl Schmitt was also not a big fan of separation of powers and what did you say? That's accurate. He's not a big fan of separation of powers or checks and balances.
What's that? Sorry.
He's a big fan of Carl Schmitt.
Schmitt was more a fan of separating Jews from their lives, I would say, than he was from separating powers. Was that too far, Thomas? I'm feeling spicy today.
Well, I think that's accurate. I mean, I don't think you can really dispute that.
Yeah, that's
yeah, no, I mean, so there's no, but that goes all the way back with this tradition of anti-liberalism. They want a strong man. They want to have it so that there's a monarch at the top, and maybe the monarch is in charge of a bureaucracy or that is integrated with the monarchy, and a high degree of discretionary power. Well, let's just, before I get into Adrian's thing, this is like zoom out here a little bit. What is this thing like? modern constitutional democracy, right? Modern constitutionalism, right? Modern constitutionalism was a response to sort of the absolutist monarchies of the early modern period, right? You don't get modern constitutionalism earlier time because you don't have a modern state to check, right?
Right.
You only have a modern state in the past, probably in ancient China, right? They're the only modern state, the thing that like a modern state that we know of in history before, the late 1400s, right?
And it retained some of what we normally consider pre-modern in that it has like an imperial court,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a lot of like religion and tradition based around the emperor and his court. You don't see courtly politics in modern constitutional democracy. At least you're not supposed to.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. So before like the 1400s in medieval Europe, the constitution of like Christendom is it's very decentralized, right? You have all these like feudal lords and princes all spread out throughout Europe. The sort of the organization that takes the function of like something like the federal government in our system, right? That mitigates the mischiefs of faction, like James Madison says in Federalist 10, is really the church, right? So the church is this check, this like sort of international check on the local powers in Europe, right? That also sort of ensures free movement and trade between all these disparate groups in Europe is really what unifies the disparate groups is their shared religion.
There's
Um,
clerical immunity, so
mhm,
and in a state where there were estates owned by the bishop, they were independent effectively of like sort of regional power, and you
that's
could
right.
actually in some cases appeal to the church for clemency from civil or criminal penalty, and the church might offer that.
Hmm.
The best thing is that if you were a peasant on church land, is that you very rarely were drafted for war.
Hmm.
So it was, and so I think that's quite right.
That's right. So as we saw, you were talking about the last few times. As soon as the states got more powerful, they built up these bureaucracies, and they had more. Their jurisdiction covered more area. Then they started to be in conflict with the papacy, and eventually
Yeah,
they became powerful enough to abandon it, which happens in the Reformation. Um, well, there's some post liberals that sort of have like this sort of a lot of post liberals don't realize the change that happened with the state. So they think of as like the what they call the Baroque period of early modern period of the absolute monarchs as being Christendom itself, right?
right.
And we've said that that's just not true, right? It was
The
a
eternal
novel thing.
Habsburg, right?
Yeah, that's right. But some of them are aware of the change and they want to go back to a more medieval framework, right? A decentralized system with the church on top. But that's
This is
also kind
Andrew
of
Willard Jones and Mark Barnes, sort of the new polity crowd, right?
yeah, that's
Where what happens is everything is great. Personal relationships between monarchy, the sort of king's two bodies, the physical representation and of the king, and how the king's body represents the people. So there's this very like um a strong antipathy for the modern state because it's abstract, it's not material.
mm-hmm.
But this is why when I describe people this position, I call them the antiquarian integralists,
Yeah.
um, because they're describing a way of life that was very temporary,
Mm-hmm.
and really is not conceivable under given circumstances. So
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting that when I wrote that review of Kevin Valier's book and I dropped that line about how Christendom created the conditions for its own failure, like it failed by succeeding, just playing off Deneen's thing.
was
I was
that
reading,
review's at Law and Liberty called "Why Integralism Failed"? Right?
yeah, that,
Oh,
yeah,
it's a
that's
delight. I enjoyed it immensely.
well, thanks, James. But I was reading something from Ronheimer from like 10 years ago, because some people have talked about translating his book on the relationship between secularity and the church. And I was reading this like sort of translated passage from it because I had to put together sort of a sample translation. And he basically makes that argument before Denis even happened. Before Denis, he says basically Christendom it failed by succeeding. It
Right.
created the conditions that would overtake it. And we
Because
just can't.
Christendom, as it's understood by these people, emerged from a collapsed empire, right? There's
Yeah,
no
that's right.
way that this stuff was going to remain the same.
Yeah, that's right. So there's no going back to Christendom, but Adrian, to his credit, doesn't think that's very realistic either. So he wants to instead go back to the early modern period, where you had sort of the absolutist kings. He thinks that it wasn't as bad as people think, probably. Um, and when you read his review of Denin's book, Integration from Within, he basically defends that we're going to abandon this sort of constitutional framework, but we can keep something good that's modern, which he says has been around in illiberal regimes as well. It's been there in ancient China. It's been there in Salazar. This bureaucratic regime, that's a good thing. We can bless that. He even says it even has the sort of sacred hierarchy of the church element to it, right? He just really loves bureaucracy.
Why does he love it so much? It's so weird. It
Yeah,
is a weird thing. Like, it is routinely one of the least popular things in the United States, and he's like, that's the thing I like.
yeah,
I like the DMV. Let's have a DMV for Catholicism.
yeah. No, that's right. No, I mean that's
Is he like a crypto Calvinist trying to destroy the Catholic Church?
no, it's amazing though. But you're seeing it now, even though a lot of the other post liberals are uneasy with his love of the bureaucracy, right?
Mm-hmm.
When COVID was happening, they were very at odds with him because he wanted to have all these mandates for vaccines, and most of it, we're
Yeah, he and
as much as
Pecknold went kind of ham on each other for a while there about this.
yeah, that's right.
Chad Pecknold at CUA, another post-liberal who's sort of withdrawn, you could say, from a lot of
Yeah.
this, but it may have actually been over COVID as possibly, but I'm not sure what
Mhm.
happened.
Yeah, it's interesting because as much as these post liberals don't like the American experiment, some of them still share our American sense of get off my lawn. And so they're only willing to go so far with Adrian Vermeule. But anyway, uh, so that's so the early modern period, though, which we've seen anti-liberals going back to the 19th century reactionaries had a very romantic review of what things were like with the early modern period with the monarchies, right? They think that things were fine when we had Louis and as a king in France, and the Jews and Masons took this from us, and now these post liberals aren't anti-Semitic. Some of them are conspiratorial, but they're not anti-Semitic. They just think that we need to go back to that, right? Um, but if you read like the some of the Spanish scholastics of like the 16th century and the early 17th century, if you read Suarez, if you read Juan de Mariana, now Suarez and Juan de Mariana had some of their books banned in not only England, but also France. Catholic France also banned some of their books because they were defending tyrannicide. They were defending a right of resistance against a tyrannical throne. And but it's interesting that later in the 19th century, you get to like Louis the Third, or sorry, Louis, not Louis, um, Leo the 13th.
Very different from Louis
Yeah,
the 13th.
yeah. He's absolutely seems opposed to any sort of revolution or any sort of like right of resistance and all of that, right? And there was a there was a Catholic scholastic thinker of the early 20th century named Heinrich Rahman, who said, well, that was just because they don't need it anymore because now we have constitutionalism. Constitutionalism institutionalizes that resistance, so you don't have to have a violent resistance. And so he's like, there's a way now to peacefully resist to carry the functions of the right of resistance in a peaceful institutional manner. That's what modern constitutionalism is.
Yeah,
So
because
it's
your
like,
alternative to sponsoring tyrannicide is to suffer tyranny, right? And
yeah,
so is it better to suffer an injustice or to end an injustice? I mean, the cross answers that in one respect, but there are alternatives for a better life, then maybe one should pursue them, since the cross isn't always a perfect analogy to all this. And also, the Spanish or the Salamancan school is offering up defenses of tyrannicide in a pre-revolutionary context,
mm-hmm,
largely kind of in terms of like dealing with potentially of the church taking the side of the people against increasingly consolidated states,
mm-hmm,
right? The church used to depose monarchs by excommunicating them, and they would be effectively alienated within
mm-hmm,
their own courts because they were considered, going to hell. Like they were causing like a disaster for human salvation, where that motive becomes increasingly difficult to use. You can instead use a motivation for the people to revolt,
mm-hmm,
and this is something that the church responds very negatively to once the actual revolution of the French starts, and it's
mm-hmm,
decidedly not on the side of the church, right? It's against the
mm-hmm.
church, hence the reactionary frame that the 19th century takes on.
Well, yeah, and they also just realize there are ways of resisting this without bringing it to bloodshed. So like and that's what modern constitutionalism has made possible, really, that you can resist this thing in a way that, if we don't like Biden or whatever, if somebody doesn't like Biden, then you can, there are also, even between elections, there are checks and balances to keep them within a certain constitutional framework that we have to agree to, and to protect basic rights, right? Um, so, but if you go back to Juan de Mariana, who's like the most fed up with absolutism, right, out of all of them. Suarez is pretty fed up with it, but Juan de Mariana is like the most fed up with absolutism. Uh, he writes this book on the education of the king, right? It's actually on the king and on the institution of the king, but it gets translated as the education of the king. Um, One of the later chapters in that book, and it's in Latin, the title, and it says um, the prince is not released from the laws, which is significant because in Roman law there's a principle that the prince is released from the laws, and there's this long tradition of softening that by saying, well, he's not released from the laws morally, but he is released from the coercive aspect of law because he's the prince. Who's the coercive power above the prince that's going to hold him to the law, right?
Charles the First argument.
Yeah, so that becomes like a weaponized in the early modern period as these absolutists are trying to say, hey, look, the Roman legal principle here, the prince is released from the laws. Well, you can see that they're already getting upset with it from the level of the scholastics, like people like Juan de Mariana. But then Juan de Mariana kind of balks because he realizes, yeah, there's no coercive power that can actually hold him in check, but he's morally bound to the law, and we should try to restore the strength of the church relative to the state so that they're a check on the state, and restore local feudal lords so that they're a check on the princes. And we need to educate the princes so that they know that they have to hold themselves to the law, right?
So Mariana wants to return.
He
He
wants to
wants to,
return, right?
with
But
a
he sees
V,
the
right? Like return to tradition.
That's right. He wants to return to tradition. But the thing is, he sees the problem. And now we can just kind of laugh at the solution, right? But they didn't know
Right.
a better solution. They didn't have
Yeah.
modern constitutionalism yet. And you see with the direction of the courts in the 1600s in England, they start to appeal to these old feudal principles from the Magna Carta, and about putting checks on the king through the parliament, that become sort of popularized to be more inclusive of people in general, not just the feudal lords. And in the 1600s, also these social contract theories coming from the Scholastics and also from the Calvinists are a big part of this. The rhetoric going on between the Whigs and the Tories dealing with whether we should have the king as an absolute monarch or the parliament should hold him in check. So we get to
Wait
the
a second,
glorious.
though. You said something about the Scholastics. I thought it was a liberal, capital L, scare quotes, idea to have a social contract.
Yeah, no, it wasn't.
Were the Salamancan Scholastics, were they capital L, scare quotes, liberal?
No, because not yet, not
Was
yet.
there
But
was there a
there are elements there that
Judeo-Masonic enclave before the creation of the Masons, hanging out in Spain, generating
no.
generating the liberalism?
Yeah, no. The problem is that their contribution though gets left out, and that these
Mhm.
things didn't just come out of the air from nowhere. Um,
Secular political thinkers like this because now they get to cut out the Catholic Church, and reactionary Catholics like to cut them out because they're an inconvenience or their
yeah,
narrative.
yeah, that's right, that's right. So, so you get the Glorious Revolution in England, really, So basically, this sort of theme and part of the political culture of England that goes back to the Middle Ages of sort of checks on the king that maybe started in a feudal society in which it was more like checks of the feudal lords on the king, right?
Mhm.
Um, but still is part of like sort of the British legal tradition and political tradition and their culture from the Middle Ages. It kind of grows that kind of evolves into the sort of more broader based view of a parliamentary system that holds the king in check. And they already had the separate judiciary in England, so they're already, you're seeing in the constitutional framework of England sort of the seeds of modern constitutionalism as it's emerging. um so Montesquieu, fast forward, and then you have Locke defending the supremacy of parliament over the
Locke.
king.
Dun dun
Yeah,
dun.
you have, I think.
You mean Captain Liberal, right? Here he
Yeah, yeah.
comes.
He's really
Uh
Captain British Whig. I mean, he's just, he just was representing their side of this dispute. When he was younger, Locke was more like Hobbes. He was more like a defender of the monarchy and the as a over and above all this other stuff. But Locke, yeah, he becomes sort of this spokesperson for the Whigs. Uh, what's his name? Algernon Sydney.
Algernon Sydney, yeah.
Adrian Sydney, he's also there, right? He's not as read as much, but so you fast forward
There's
then to
a
the.
college in Virginia named after Algernon Sydney, and another guy from that period, I forget his first name, at Hamden. So there's Hamden Sydney College.
Oh, cool! I
Sort of
didn't know
this
that.
odd English Whig tradition in the middle of Virginia.
Oh, that's great. Now you had William and Mary there, University there too,
They
I
should hate
think.
each other, right? Because there's William and Mary and Hamden Sydney. It should be like a rivalry, but it's not.
That's funny. But you get to the 1700s though, and you have these people like Montesquieu that are reflecting on the British Constitution. It becomes more of a doctrine, even more than it was in Locke. It becomes more like elaborated. It comes to the level of like political economic analysis in the Scottish Enlightenment figures, people like Hume and Ferguson and Smith. And then you get, all the American founding generation is like the most literate generation in world history, right? And they're reading Montesquieu. They're reading, what's the other one? Blackstone also talks about the
Blackstone.
checks and balances of the British.
The American founders during the ratification debate engage in what I describe to my students as a Montesquieu off,
Oh,
where
okay.
where anti-federalists and federalists are trying to claim the authority of Montesquieu. Like Federalist 9 is just Alexander Hamilton reading the Riot Act to the anti-federalists about how much better his reading of Montesquieu is than theirs.
Oh,
I mean, it's more to it than that, of course, but what's funny about that is that the significance of Montesquieu is that he's the first person to think seriously about regimes based at the level that he does,
hmm
in a way that sort of complicates the Aristotelian conceptions that had been around. And
hmm
Montesquieu does this because he's noticed that that regimes have become more complicated than the 2 by 3 table that you get with Aristotle, which is that you have 3 regimes: rule by the many, rule by the few, and rule by the one. And then
Mm-hmm.
on the y-axis, the vertical, it's good and bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what's funny is that the good one for the many is kind of unclear if there is one. But and what Montesquieu wants to do is he wants to talk about what he's witnessed in like the Venetian Republic, which is the one that Hamilton wants to say the
Mm-hmm.
United States should model, as well as the Swiss cantons, and they're more the sort of ancestral conception of republican government, small, homogenous, but also incredible at defending themselves because they're defending their homeland, versus that of extensive monarchies. And he comes down, it's a very tricky writer, Montesquieu, but he comes down very much in the sense of monarchy is great when most people are kind of bad. Uh, and he's writing this as a subject to the French monarchy, and himself a member of the aristocracy. So he's having to be very careful. I'm sorry to keep interrupting with this,
No.
but Montesquieu is also effectively building off of a special man from Florence who had some opinions on church rule as well, a man named
Mm.
Niccolo Machiavelli.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to bring this up because I was educated by Straussians. So the second I hear this, I have to like give this disquisition, or they pull my Strauss card and I don't get to go to the meetings anymore.
Mm. That's funny. No, but so so Montesquieu and Blackstone also sort of Blackstone's just like the last of these great tradition
Yeah.
of like British legal theorists that comment on the British legal. They're almost like both the commentators, but they're also like apologists for the British constitutional system.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of still kind of cool though. I mean, even though it's apologetics, it's like, but they really do identify some good things about the British constitutional system. That that which is why Britain was so. I think the reason Britain ended up becoming when they become sort of when they started to meet the ideals in reality. Because
Yeah.
sometimes these people like held up these ideals that were sort of like ideals, but the reality was much more messy. When the reality started to reach, catch up with the ideals, then Britain becomes very successful. So I guess that's just teaching your political culture over a long time.
A political
Um,
culture and a strong navy. These are the
and a
two
strong
things.
navy. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, things would have been much worse if the Spanish Armada would have been successful against them. Um, so so you get to the so back to Vermeule then. So Vermeule rejects that whole tradition of modern constitutionalism. He thinks it was a failure. He says in the Constitution of Risk that um, his interpretation of tell me what you think about this because you're an Americanist, James. His interpretation of Federalist 10 and what Madison's doing there is that Madison's trying to have so the Constitution prevents their public opinion from ruling. But I didn't interpret that at all. I took it in terms of he's trying to make it so that the reason of the people is what rules, not the passions. So you separate things enough and you check them enough so that it ends up being the reason of the people that ends up ruling instead of the passions, right?
I mean,
Not
if
the
that's
short
the
term
position he
passions.
takes, it's a very partial reading, right?
Yeah, so he's a
Because
very part.
Madison is, or Publius, but it's Madison who writes 10. Um, he describes there are two institutional solutions to popular government. There's
Mm-hmm,
direct rule by the people, and there's representation. And direct rule by the people subject to problems of immediate passions. And here he's
mm-hmm.
pulling from the examples of Athenian democracy. Is it, I forget which city it is in Athens during the Peloponnesian War. Is it Milos, where on one day the assembly says in anger that they want to kill everyone on the island after subduing it, and then the next day they kind of feel bad, so they're like,
Mm-hmm.
maybe just the men. But they had already sent the trireme out to the island to go kill everyone. So they get all the fastest rowers they can and tell them to row fast, and both boats arrive at the same time. And part of the reason was that the first trireme didn't exactly want to go kill a bunch of kids, so they weren't rowing in a hurry. So they get there, and fortunately, the children and women are spared. The men are not.
Mm.
But that example of wild swings of opinion is an indication of the problems you get with democracy. And Madison's thinking about these things, right?
Yeah.
When he's writing. And so, what representation does is it gives the people an opportunity to participate in a government not by directly voicing their opinions, but by
Hmm.
rather selecting the people whose opinions will be heard at the representative body. And in this respect, Madison's only speaking of the federal constitution. He's not describing the way that towns would govern.
Yeah.
They don't have to have representation there. It's just for the ratification of the Constitution. Often people forget that part.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it sounds like Adrian did.
Yeah. So what? So he basically says, "Oh, look, they failed because now we're still run by public opinion." And I was like, "That's."
No, we're not.
I know. I was reading this. I was just baffled. And he said, so, and he says that maybe makes it so that it doesn't get as bad as otherwise could, but it can't be as good as otherwise could be
Yeah.
too. So we're stuck with a mediocre government, he says, because we're actually still run by public opinion and not the aristocracy, not the experts or whatever he says. So,
He's literally the opposite of William F. Buckley writes. Like, we should really be ruled by the Harvard faculty and not the
yeah,
first 100 names in
yeah, that's
the
right.
Boston Telephone book. It's
Yeah,
whenever he says things like elites or bureaucracies or executives should do things, what he really means is himself, right? He's just people
yeah,
who think like him.
yeah, that's right. So, I mean, so that kind of connects with what Deneen says in Regime Change, how it's not a checks and balances system between the aristocracy and the people, but a blending so that they become integrated with each other. So they have common interests. Yeah, that's whatever. But um, so Vermeule, yeah, that's his interpretation. He says, but see, I think of things more holistically than he does. I think of government as always being kind of inefficient, but it's sort of a necessary evil that we need, right? And my thinking is, how's our nation thriving, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if inefficient bureaucracy turns out to be, a trade-off for our nation thriving, right? That's the main goal. So then I say, government, you did your job. Good job, mediocre government, because whatever. But he seems to think of it like separating the two. So it's just focusing on the government itself, and he's analyzing the government itself, and he sees all these inefficiencies. And like they'd be doing so much better at like governmenting if we just gave them more power and more discretion, right? Instead of having the people who don't know anything getting in the way of this. But then because he doesn't look at it holistically, he admires countries like China and the CCP. I mean, he doesn't. I can't find this in his published works, but we all know he does because he he likes Chinese propaganda on Twitter.
Yeah, I was
He
gonna say his social media engagement is like Xi Jinping's dream.
Yeah, no, really.
Yeah.
I mean, there was something about like making fun of rumors about this woman who was killed by the CCP, and it was a Chinese propaganda account,
Oh yeah,
and he's
Pang
liking
is
it.
it? Yeah, I saw that. Oh, it was
Mm.
gross.
Yeah, so we
Michael
shouldn't. I mean, I shouldn't be
Sobolik or
talking about
someone
this. Okay.
was pointing this out. He's been kind of on this beat for a while now at Providence.
Yeah. So what are the rules on that? Like, I can't. Can I bring up his social media stuff because it seems to me relevant for
It's our
understanding what he?
podcast.
Huh?
We can do what we want. It's our podcast. I'm
It's
sorry, I'm
our
looking at
podcast.
yeah, I'm
Okay.
looking at this stuff.
So that's in the background of what he sees as a better alternative. And the same thing with Salazar's Portugal, right? He, uh, in what sense is Salazar's Portugal doing a better job than the U.S. government's
It was
doing?
very good at killing political opposition.
Yeah, yeah, it's
I
very
mean,
good.
crooks missed, all right. The PIDE, they did not miss. They shot people and put them in jail. Or
Mm-hmm.
they didn't shoot people and then put them in jail. They shot people or put them in jail. I don't think once you shoot a person, you don't need to put them in jail. But yeah, that Salazar, especially like Salazar, was relatively tame compared to some other post-liberal countries, like
Mm-hmm.
at the time in Portugal. But he was quite vicious in Portuguese imperial or colonial areas. He gave them much more latitude to use violence. And
Well,
that's ultimately the way that you resolve political conflict
hmm
if you don't have a constitutional order for representation.
yeah. Um, so I mean, it kind of seems to me then because he's so focused, his idea almost is like that American political culture is what makes us great, and despite our bad government. Instead of thinking that like what he calls bad government is actually the right amount of balance that we need for people to live their lives and make good decisions, to build businesses and start charities or do all the things that they do at the level of civil society, and that some of the gridlock and inefficiencies that come with that are actually more a blessing than anything else. That's how I think of it holistically. He just sees the inefficiency and the gridlock and like, look, we need a better government so that we can do this, right? And
Does he
just go.
account at any point for the fact that bureaucrats have their own interests?
I
Uh,
haven't seen any he cites a couple public choice figures to make some 1 point one time, but he doesn't seem to understand, or he doesn't seem to engage with what I've seen. I haven't seen him yet engage with the literature on public choice, but I'm sure he might. I haven't read all the stuff, but he might.
yeah, it's because all this talk about bureaucracy seems to black box it a bit, and maybe that's
Mhm.
just the nature of our conversation. And you haven't finished doing a lit review, but
Yeah.
it is exhausting to read him talking about bureaucracy without making concessions to the fact that bureaucrats have their own interests
hmm
in a non-constitutional circumstance. The way they deal with these interests is very closely resembling the imperial sort of courtly approach, where they're
hmm
trying to gain access to the decision makers and plot and scheme to get people fired and thrown out.
hmm
There's nothing about that sounds very efficient. It sounds pretty bad.
Yeah, I think he tries to balance that in his book Law and Leviathan, Redeeming the Administrative State, by without institutional fix, just have a convince bureaucrats to hold themselves to a better political morality. At some level, we have to rely on political morality in the sense of, we want the judges, the justices or the judges, we want them to hold themselves to a certain political morality when they're judging cases or whatever.
So he's
Sure.
just giving, so he gives away an institutional correction here, which is, Hamilton
hmm
describes it as having interest do the work of virtue, right?
Yeah.
Where people maybe lack political virtue, at least their desire to remain in office or to secure something else for themselves might make them do the right thing. And this is just a plain recognition of the fact that people in office have their own interests, and it just seems
Yeah.
like he wishes to assert the contrary. And there's a great article called Confucian Integralism by a person named Wong at America Magazine,
hmm
in which they describe China for Vermeule and other post-liberals as an imaginary. It's
hmm
not the China that Vermeule imagines is not China. China is
hmm
shot through with graft and patronage
hmm
and intrigue, and none of that makes their bureaucracy more efficient. It makes it less efficient
hmm
because what's often traded is traded to the people away, or the things that are for the people that are not at the table. So ordinary Chinese people who are stuck, unable to move out of the district they're in, are instead subject to whether the person negotiating on their behalf negotiates in their interests or his own, and it's always his own. So
hmm
they don't get roads built, they don't get houses built to standard because they're often
hmm
engaging in horse trading over building materials. This is how you end up with what's called tofu construction,
hmm
where the house or the apartment building looks nice, but all you have to do is just stick your hand into the wall and you'll be
hmm
able to pull out chunks of it. And it's because the quality of that house was traded away in a negotiated deal that went into the pocket of the bureaucrat, and somehow this is better. And Wong's
hmm
response is that they're not interested in this. They don't want to think
Yeah.
about this because this is what's inconvenient for them. What instead they want to do is they want to take China as a black box and beat it over the head of ordinary Americans or conservatives who don't sign on to authoritarianism.
hmm And I mean, we saw like in COVID too, how difficult it is to get accurate data in a communist or in a country like that because everyone's scared to report anything that makes the regime look bad. so they get fired or killed or whatever. So so it's like,
Yeah.
the sort of hierarchy of fear that's created is not necessarily going to contribute to efficiency either.
And it was the same in the United States in our bureaucracy,
Hmm.
right? Like they went through the same thing. And the ability for the bureaucracy to get away with a lot of that stuff is largely the consequence of imagining our country without a Congress.
Hmm.
We our Congress is not terribly strong right now. This is
Hmm.
Yuval Levin's big point right now. Congress is weak because its members want it to be weak. And so, Fauci never got fired for anything that he did with the
Hmm.
virology lab. There wasn't a serious inquiry into the origin of COVID, on which I'm not a scientist, so I don't have like a strong opinion. But there was a lot of effort among NatSec area to subvert efforts for people to discuss the subject matter on social media. The bureaucracy
Hmm.
was very good at that, and Adrian was all over that. He loved that,
Hmm. Yeah.
and it was terrible. It was really bad. It
Yeah.
was some of the worst stuff to come out of there, and he's like, "More of that, please."
Hmm. No, that's right. Yeah. I mean, it's so this is what I'm finding, right? And I'm going to continue to research it and study it. I didn't even get to like the guilds yet and the corporatism. We can save that for a later episode. Maybe we can talk to Catherine about that.
Yeah, I think
Yes.
corporatism would be good for to talk to Catherine with, because being an economist, she knows a lot about this approach, and it was also like the post-liberal political economy, and we've talked about this before. Like, they're supposedly not on, I don't think on here, but like in our own conversations, where there's a lot of effort to kind of apply Catholic political economy from Leo the 13th and Pius the 11th.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it backfires, or they had no intention of doing so, and they used those as a cover story for subjugating labor and capital to the interest of the state.
Mm. What's interesting, it just as like a little interesting historical point before we get into a real critique of it. So Franco's Spain followed a sort of corporatist economic model from
Yeah,
Mussolini, and it was stagnant and terrible in like the 1950s. It was just
it was
the
awful.
economy was just awful. So Franco brings in these Opus Dei economists,
Yeah,
and they convince him to liberate the economy, like liberalize it away from this sort of corporatist model. And what happened was called by historians of the time the Spanish economic miracle. So they had the Spanish economic miracle by abandoning corporatism.
yeah. It was, all these aspects to the Franco's regime from the 1930s make Spain a backwater and an
Mm-hmm.
embarrassment. And as he one by one slowly ends the things that defined his political vision in the 1930s, only then does Spain get better.
Yeah, that's right.
Um, it's not like the Spanish Republicans, had they won against Franco, would have followed this pattern either. They were
No.
both pretty miserable. But
Mm-hmm.
the nation of Spain was under like some sort of divine punishment, that they had to choose
Yeah.
between anti-clerical murderers and Francisco Franco, who killed his fair share of priests, but not
Yeah.
nearly as many as the Spanish Republicans did. And so, um, all you can do when you look at the Spanish Civil War is there but the grace of God, right? It's just so bad.
Yeah. Yeah. I know it's so bad. But you know what? Those people had an excuse, or we don't anymore. So,
No, no, there
um,
is. So the problem of corporatism is that it does at least have a kind of papal imprimatur on it, right? It's that this was something that early 20th century popes recommended, and
at
if we
least
leave
Pius the
aside the
11th
fact
did.
that, what's that?
At least Pius the 11th did, I guess.
Yeah.
Mhm.
How many Nobel prizes does he have in economics? Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah. We'll talk a little. When we bring this up again, you can talk about that book, Papal Economics. It
Oh
was
yeah,
by one
yeah,
of JP2's advisors, right?
yeah, and published on ISI Press. Rest in peace, which has been sold to Regnery. Is it Regnery?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but we were talking about this before we started. But one of the greatest graphs ever created was of Catholic social teaching on political economy, and they use these little hands to point in different directions for the positions popes took. And I would
Mhm.
not describe this graph as consistent. Um,
Yeah. And
but
we'll get into that more later. But the
yeah,
issue
I'm
is
sorry.
that,
I
oh
should
no,
have
it's
saved it.
okay.
I should have
It's
saved it.
okay. The issue is the popes have some authority, and they have authority in interpreting the natural law. But when it gets to like sort of institutional questions about institutional design, apparently there's no charism for that.
No.
So it just depends on how much that particular pope knows about it.
And
So that's why John
if
Paul
you toss
II
people
gets
like
by
Montesquieu in
because
the
he's just really
trash and
smart.
what's
What's up?
that?
John Paul II gets by just because he's really friggin' smart. But
Is
like,
a quick
not every
study.
pope's gonna know that stuff as well.
And if you take institutional design, put it in a box called liberalism, and throw it in the trash, you get yourself into a lot of trouble, because
Yeah.
now you've just denied yourself a lot of what's important for understanding modern constitutional states, and saying, "Oh
Mm-hmm.
yeah, well we're just not going to have one." You end up with a Franco situation where everyone's starving and leaving.
Yeah. And that's not good for the common good.
No.
No. That's the other thing is uh, Vermeule says some pretty good things on common good and common good constitutionalism about the common goods of justice, peace, and abundance. And he takes that trifold from the Ragion d'Estat literature, of the 1600s. But I don't get how his favorite regimes fulfill that better than the United States. That doesn't make sense to me at all. And I haven't been able to understand. I really just don't understand how he thinks it does. That's confusion.
And I wrote a review of that at Law and Liberty called "Uncommonly Bad Constitutionalism," because I am very funny and deserve all the plaudits for coming up with that title. Really, coming up with that title is just about being mean. I have a mean streak, and I was reading this book, and I was like, I can't believe I have to read this book. Awkward edit that you probably just watched. I've been sitting here waiting for 15 minutes for Tom to get enough charge on his phone so we could do an outro, but we were at the end of that conversation anyway, so we're just going to leave it. I apologize for what's probably going to be an incredibly awkward and clumsy edit done. That probably will be done on like a 90-day free trial of editing software. Thank you so much, Tom, for enlightening us about constitutional political economy of post-liberalism. We might do another episode to update some of your findings after you've completed the lit review. So thanks, everyone. I guess I got to do the YouTube thing where I say don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more. We're now on Spotify. The link is going to be on a post on the channel, and we're going to be on iTunes shortly. They have a bit of a review process. So once that's done, you'll see a post on YouTube as well. So I hope everyone has a wonderful week, and we'll see you next week with hopefully a Dr. Catherine McCulloch.